And I call the honourable member for wherever.
In his contribution, as well as outlining a bit of family history, the member for Eden Monaro claimed credit for the Liberal Party for Australia's industrial relations system, insofar as Sir George Reid, Liberal Prime Minister of this country, was instrumental at that period. Having been a previous member for Reid, I hazard to guess that I know slightly more about his history and nature than the member for Eden Monaro. In actual fact, I've got great confidence that if Reid was around at this period of history, he would not be supporting these measures, because we have had a very fundamental change of the power relativities in this country over the last few decades. If, for the sake of argument, the opposition was correct in their analogy of a hugely powerful trade union movement, massive wage increases throughout the economy, high levels of unionisation, there might intellectually be some defence of these changes. The member for Eden Monaro talked about a rebalance, that things had gone too far under the previous government. In actual fact, the previous government in no way fundamentally reclaimed large areas of industrial relation change in this country engineered by the previous Howard government. They made some gestures back in the other direction, but there has been a fundamental shift of power in this country occasioned by casualisation, the smaller average unit of employment, all of these things, the import of overseas labour, de-skilling, contraction of manufacturing industry, all of these realities are what is occurring in Australian industrial relations. So there is no real picture as presented by the opposition. It's a very different industrial climate in this country. I want to say that the reality was perhaps driven home yesterday by the decision in the Fair Work Commission to strip 25% of weekend penalties for people in the catering industry. And it was spoken of as being labour cost relief, and they held out the hopeful dream that it may, quote, consider the reopening of some venues. This come after complaints that luxury liners in Sydney couldn't get breakfast when the people got off the boat. And it was also preceded by comments by the New South Wales Chamber, Business Chamber, of, quote, spiralling up at a rate that makes operating on weekends simply unaffordable. That was the contention of the Chamber, and they said that the lure of penalty rates is meaningless for staff. Well, I doubt that in actual fact. I think it's fairly fundamental in the low wages in that structure. You just got to look at the actual payments out there, that many of these people very much need those penalty rates. And it's probably what attracts a few of them to the industry. But this was occasioned by a Herald Sun editorial under war declared on penalty rates back on the 5th of February. Mike Smith, ANZ Bank Chief Executive, noted, "We see diminishing numbers of reform-minded individuals on both sides of politics, and even more worrying, we have seen the emergence of political parties and politicians whose views no longer describe the reality." John Hart, of course, a very big operator in the restaurant and catering sector, he was out there yesterday very much supporting this decision. He had earlier said that it was disgraceful that people got $27 an hour on weekends, and I want to stress that's what they get on weekends. That's not what they get most of the week, and that should be borne in light of what we think about people's wage rates. At that time, the Australian Industry Group put on the agenda, through Chief Innes Wilcox, the long-term aims of business in this country. They want to control. He said they want to control workers' annual leave taking. They want to cash out annual leave, which they've allowed to accumulate, quite frankly. I think people should take their annual leave as early as possible. That's why we have it. They want to change in time off, in lieu, and part-time operations. Of course, John Hart, who's so vocal in this sector, recently gained some notoriety, not only as a failed pre-selection candidate in the Liberal Party of Parramatta a few years ago, but he, of course, claimed some notoriety in recent weeks as being the driving force behind the member for North Sydney's operation, the North Sydney Forum, where, of course, business sector, keen business sector partygoers were encouraged to pay as much as $22,000 to be at the table with the Treasurer, and some people were getting as low as $3,000. So that is very much the reality of industrial relations in this country. That stripping of people's conditions yesterday is what is occurring, and what I've said are the words of the Australian Industry Group is what the agenda is in this country. And it is not an era of trade union rampant power in this country. And I've got to say that it's not only in what we're seeing in this legislation, but it's also in relation to the question of immigration that we're seeing the government's real agenda. And in the bid to get rid of this ever-present red tape, we saw the recent decision in regards to 457 skilled migrant entry to this country. In 2013, Labor closed what I think is a loophole that should be basically destroyed, that companies in the mining, construction and IT industries could knowingly hire hundreds of foreign workers more than they'd actually applied for and needed. In one example, quoted in The Age, an employer was granted approval for 100 visas over 3 years, but in 18 months brought in 800 workers under the 457. Before the cap was introduced in 2013, the number of 457 visas was quickly rising. In the financial year 2009-10, there were 68,000 granted. By 2012-13, there was 126,000, and that is why the previous government, belatedly, as far as I'm concerned, did something about making sure that there were restrictions on this. The article went on to quote, "These secretive changes come on the back of the government's announced review, which has been stacked to deliver a predetermined outcome that will hurt Australian workers." So they're basically getting rid of the requirement that there be advertising and liberalising so that you can have far more visas. Now, the member for Eden Monaro, I was interested in the fact that he said this legislation was, quote, the government was starting to do things. So we know in the elections that there was no intimation that in this legislation they would go beyond the actual inquiry in this sector, but they've done this in legislation. But he said that this was only the start. Now, he also pontificated about a correlation between industrial relations regulation and employment. Now, on both sides of politics, the evidence for this is pretty porous. It's pretty non-existent. And I remember in the previous parliament, people on this side of Parliament were able to bring forward statistics in this country that indicated that levels of productivity, for instance, were not in correlation, not connected with loosening up of the industrial relations system. Now, he went on to talk about the unemployment rates at this time being in some way, and in the previous government being connected with industrial relations. Look, we know what happened internationally at that time. The US housing crisis, the global crisis, what occurred around that period. We know that it's related to retractions in mining demand from China and India. These are the factors that dominate in regards to employment levels. And to put here today that this is going to lead to some massive job creation and it's going to totally liberalise employers' willingness to hire people really is, he described it as job creating. I was interested to note that he did say that the government did want workers' conditions to, quote, improve over time. The message is intense suffering through changes such as this and a hope that eventually things would improve. He spoke of Labor unwinding bipartisan workplace changes. Well, I think clearly this is significant change away from the middle ground. It is in the context of, as I say, a decisive downgrading of industrial relations power by the union movement. And when he talks about a correlation between unemployment and liberalised marketplaces in regards to labour, we see at the moment in the United States, Obama struggling to try and lift the minimum wage of $7.25 to $10.10 by 2016. Its level now is lower than 1978. That's the reality of deregulated labour markets and an ineffective union force and campaigns to make sure that unions can't get membership, that people are intimidated into not joining. And it's worth noting once again, if we look at unemployment levels in the United States and Australia, if I was going to be a total muttonhead in this whole issue, I'd argue that there's a direct correlation between the United States' low unionisation and high unemployment in the country. over a long period of time. That's not been the case. It's not connected. We know there are intrinsic reasons in very many economies as to why there are particular levels of unemployment. And when he's talking about the question of being concerned about unemployment, I have more respect for the chief economist, senior economist Brian Redkin from the Macquarie Bank and a former Reserve Bank economist about the possibilities of where unemployment's really going to come from. In an article on the 17th of January this year in the Financial Review, he said, clearly the direct effect of spending cuts is less spending in the economy and there will be less employment as a result. The question of whether the potential benefit of that less spending, lower interest rates, for example, provide a bit of an offset. While they might provide an offset, usually the benefit is further out, whereas the spending cuts start affecting employment negatively immediately. So, the reality is that this budget's going to have a lot more impact on employment and the possible retraction of spending, sacking of public servants, than a liberalisation of workplace conditions. Now, amongst the aspects of this bill that would cause concern are the way in which these agreements can be entered into between an employer and employer to provide a more flexible workplace. That is intelligent to operate. Everyone supports that concept. If both sides of the industrial relations barriers decide individually that it's better to sacrifice a few penalty rates to facilitate something that affects the family, to let the bloke go and train the football team once a week, or to help at the canteen, the woman to help at the canteen on the weekend, etc. That forgoing some kind of conditions for that is a sensible way of operating, and there shouldn't be interference from the trade unions in that. And that's already a distinct possibility in the current operation. But what we see here is a situation where they're setting up a defence for employers who intimidate individuals to give up conditions by having them sign these agreements. Supposedly a defence for the employee, but what it really becomes is a form of evidence for the employer later that the employee really knew what they were doing at the time. And in some cases, it's going to be by coercion because it's more advantageous to the employer for the employee to agree to that. And also we know that certain conditions in the existing measures in regards to how much that financial loss is and whether it's comparable or in some ways commensurate with what is sacrificed are being abandoned here. And of course, as well as that, there was previously a condition that there would have to be prior information to the Ombudsman in relation to these changes. All of those things are scrapped. So what we do see effectively is not a change that will facilitate the employee's right to give up a few conditions in return for something that's important to him, but a situation where power shifts very massively to the employer so that they can get what they want. I'm also concerned about these greenfield sites provisions. They essentially, to me, are a recipe for getting in the unions that are more compliant, regardless of how much support they have from the workers on the site. If there is a union that is not desired by the employer, then one can be certain that the deal will be reached with that which is seen as more willing to toe the line, the typical HSU that we've seen in the last few years with its national officials. That's the kind of body that's going to be called in and will be preferred over other unions that basically are not as inclined to go along with things. So, as I say, I think this measure is not defensible. It is not about helping employees. It's not about trying to have a middle ground, to have a sensible compromise. In regard to these new greenfield sites, what we're also going to see is a method for employers to essentially negotiate with themselves. It will be a fait accompli for the employees, regardless of their intention as to which unions they want to have there. And finally, of course, under some kind of rhetoric about employee representatives flying around in luxury aircrafts, the question about right of entry will involve severe restrictions. It's very much now the employer's argument as to how much he or she thinks his place is violated and interfered with by the workers' representatives' attendance that is going to predominate as to when people get entry. Thank you.
I thank the member for Werriwa.